So now we get to the part where you're going to sew your bag together. So you can kind of play around with how big you want everything to be. I usually like to have my button hole kind of right in the middle, so it's not very much there. So you'll want to sew your button on first, so figure out your placement and where you want that to be, and I think I want mine about there. So there's a lot of playing around with what do you like, where do you want it. So mine will probably go right there. So I generally, to sew a button on, I give myself a decent amount of yarn. So mine's probably way longer than I need, but it's better to be safe than sorry. And you'll want to take your needle. Sometimes I have found that these yarn needles that I use can be too thick to go through. This one works, but in some buttons that I have found, my needle won't go through, and I'll have to go down to a sewing needle where it's smaller just to sew this on. You can do that, or you can use yarn. It's whatever you want to do and whatever works. So I like to use the yarn because I want it to match the color, and it's a little thicker. But you can do, I've done both too. So I know where I want my button to be. So I'll just hold that into place. And I'll come behind and try to find one of the holes to insert my needle through. And I don't tie a knot on the end. You can, but I want to be able to weave my yarn back through my project, so I'm not going to tie a knot this time. So I'll just pull just so there's a little bit extra. So try not to pull too hard, otherwise it'll pull through and you'll be going in a circle trying to sew this on. And so I'm going to do a crisscross pattern. So just going into the other side. So you don't want to pull it too hard because then you'll pull that through. So with yarn you won't have to do it quite as many times because it's so thick. Because it already fills up the holes pretty well. So I might do one more time, but I usually don't do it more than 2 times just because it's quite thick. So I'll probably do one more time just to add that extra security. Because now I'm getting to a point I almost can't pull my needle through. Sometimes that's a struggle. I usually just wiggle it around and it'll loosen the yarn to let it go through the hole. You just kind of have to play around with it. So one more. And you can do this as tight as you want your button to be. I like to keep mine pretty tight because they get loose over time. Alright, so this will be the last one. And try not to sew into your threads like I'm about to. There we go. Always check to make sure you pull all the way through. Otherwise you'll have a big mess on this side. You don't want that. And this is the part where you could do a knot, which I might actually do one little knot to tie the 2 ends together. Let me go through maybe one more just to add a little security. So you want to pull it pretty tight so it kind of blends in with your other stitches. And then I'm going to cut this part that I've been sewing with. I'm going to cut it a little shorter, not much, just give yourself a couple inches here. And then I'm going to thread our 2 ends into our work. Now what I like to do when it comes to threading in or sewing in your threads, is I like to look for where there's a couple loops that we did, and I like to tuck my needle behind those and kind of work my way through a couple of them. That'll hold some of your thread in place. And I've heard that if you go back and then back one more time, that should keep it in place too. Because your yarn can stretch a little bit, so you don't want it to come through. So you want to go back and forth a couple times. And I try to, like, this is where my loop was. I don't go back through that loop. I go over it to go to the next one to kind of add a little more security. So I do that both times. So when I went this way, I went into the next one, and then this way I went into the next one. You don't want to go back through the same way. Otherwise you'll be just going back and forth and you won't actually be securing your project. So now you can see that that's in there, and even if I stretch, it's not going to go anywhere. So you'll do the same thing on this side, but I like to go the other way, just to keep my ends in different places. Because when I first started crocheting, I used to just keep my ends all together, and sometimes they come loose. They're all going the same direction. So I find those clusters, and I only do it a few. You could go all the way across, but it's not needed, and you don't have enough thread to. So this one I might only be able to go 2 different directions. Sometimes that's the case. Just clip as close as you can without cutting your piece. Just as close as you can to that thread you just sewed in, and then it will be tucked underneath. So you do that for both sides. And now it's all woven in. No one can't see them. So we have our button on, and it's secured. So now what we have left to do is we're going to sew both of these sides. Not the top, just these 2 sides here. So I'll show how to do that. So you want to get some more thread. You might have some extra. I have plenty right here. So you want to get some thread and thread your needle. What I like to do with my pieces is I like to turn them inside out, because then it hides all my stitches on the inside and it looks neater on the outside. So you just have to, if you want to keep your measurements and stuff the same and not lose them, you could pin, even take like some safety pins, and then turn it inside out, and that way you won't lose where your measurements and everything are when you turn it inside out, which I think I'm going to do that right now. Okay, so I safety pinned mine just so that when I turn it inside out, I don't have to worry about losing what I have already. If you don't have safety pins, then I suggest measuring how big everything is, and then when you turn it inside out or flip it the other way, you just know what your measurements are. So I have everything pinned, so I can just turn everything inside out, and I don't have to worry about where everything's going because it will all line up. When we're sewing, I like to start at the bottom, because then when I sew my ends in, they're more in a secured place than up here where this is getting pulled apart when we open our bag. I like to have it where it won't be forced open and make any possibility of our, ends coming loose. So I'm going to undo this safety pin so I'm not going to do any tying, because at the end when I'll go up and then I'll come back down, and then we can do our tying and then weaving, kind of like we did with the button. And so what I like to do with sewing, and in this case I'm just looking for a loop, one of our loops, and then another loop. And that's really all I'm looking for. And I kind of just loop it back around. So we'll cut a, I don't know what kind of stitch you would call this, but I'm just making sure to grab, and it's okay if you want to grab two, because this is kind of on where we did our chain, so you might be grabbing a couple. See if I can get this up closer so you guys can see what I'm doing. So I'm really just bringing this front and going through. So I'm really just grabbing. You can even grab two. I try to just stick with one because you don't want it to be too gappy right there. So just grab, like if you want to just grab those two. So there's one here and one here on each side. That's usually the best way, I find. Trying to do it as close as you can together. Keep your stitches nice and tight. And this is a safe place where we should be able to take this one off, because we've worked most of this and it should line up. Work back. And now this one, we won't be able to really see which, you know, where our two stitches are that we were doing before, so I usually just go back through. And sometimes you might see where you were sewing, and I almost like to try to make an X if you can do that. If not, it's alright if you're working in the same ones. So just work all the way back to where you started. And then I'll show how we tie it off and then weave in our ends. So what I'll do is I'll probably just poke my needle through to meet this other thread on this other side, so they're on the same side. So I'm gonna tie my knot and do 1 or 2 knots just to kind of add it and secure it. And then we'll do like we did with the button and weave in our ends. And do it a couple times like I showed you. Do it one way and then weave it back the other way, and then try, if you can, try to weave it one more time. So try to do it at least 3 times. And then do the same thing on the other side. And then I'll meet you after you've done that. So I just finished doing the other side. So we still have these 2 ends to weave in. So weave in those ends as well. Alright, now that we finally have all of our ends woven in, we can finally turn our project the other way. So you can pop your corners out. And see how like it was very neat. We didn't see all the stuff that we're doing, so the ends are nice and clean. Just pop out all your little corners there. And now it should all line up. And then we've got our bag. So now you can do all sorts of things with your bag. Thank you for watching.